Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Red Funnel Isle of Wight Literary Festival. It's a great pleasure this afternoon to introduce our next author, who's far more than an author. Many of you, I can see, many of you already know General Sir Simon, but we are delighted this morning to have General Sir Simon Mayall with us to talk about his latest book. The General is a scholar, having studied history at Oxford. Then he went to do what I would call a proper MA at King's College London. And then, of course, a stellar career in the army, commanding at every level: Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, and many places in between. He was quite rightly showered with honours and awards, and after an almost 40-year career, was sent to the Tower of London as the Lieutenant of the Tower of London. But today, he's going to talk about something which I know is very close to his heart, and something which I know he is extremely respected for in the Arab world. Having been in that part of the world myself, and I know from many people who serve in the Iraqi armed forces particularly, just how much they hold General Sir Simon in great respect. He really understands how that part of the world talks. In many ways, he is the uniformed Jeremy Bowen. So, General, without any further ado, may I introduce to you a true soldier in the sand.
How's that? That's better. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, very good morning to you, and thank you very much indeed for coming to hear me give a few words on a subject very dear to my heart, as Morris said, the Middle East. It's an area to get very depressed about sometimes. The news headlines are, I won't say uniformly dismal, but it's an area of huge cultural significance. It's an area at the heart of those awful headlines of people, families, wives, husbands, brothers, children, etc., who are impacted by the volatility. And there are reasons for that volatility and that violence, sadly, which are not going to go away at any time soon. I love the area. I was brought up in it. As I'll explain, part of this talk will be some of the Middle East, and part of it will be the family connection, which is nearly 100 years old from the time of my grandmother, who was deployed as part of the British effort against the Ottomans as a very, very advanced, talented lady, a doctor, in 1916. So our connections there have been for a long time through my father as well. The book itself, I promised myself I'd never write one. It's the sort of usual thing. I like lecturing about the Middle East. And eventually I picked a title about 10 years ago. And then I got into that classic cocktail party conversation, what are you doing? I'm writing my first book. Oh, really? Nor am I. Which is really the reality. Everybody picks a title, scribbles something, and then starts saying, I'm writing a book. Absolute rubbish. I got caught out eventually because I'd played this line to somebody, forgot him again. He then asked me again, and I said, oh, I'm writing a book. He said, is that after the last one you were talking about writing? And I felt I was becoming a bit of a bloody charlatan until I did write it. I'm just conscious where I am in the Isle of Wight. I just thought I'd just read one anecdote that amused me when I was coming over here yesterday, and it just said, this is about Iraq, just after the British forces were in Basra, and it said, a narrow channel also took ships up to the Iraqi port of al-Qasr. Jeff Hoon, the defense secretary, had once compared this port to Southampton. A journalist hunted down some soldiers from Hampshire and asked them what he thought of the comparison. He's obviously never been to al-Qasr or to Southampton, said one. It's got no booze, no women, and there's a good chance of getting shot at, said the other. He paused for a moment. I think it's rather more like Portsmouth. So good civic competition. That is Soldier in the Sand. That is the glamour shot, the one on the left. I said to an old girlfriend, dare I put this on the back of the book? And she said, if not you, who? And if not now, when? So I took a shot. But that, to an extent, really captured as a soldier, if you like, the glamour the sort of murderous glamour of soldiering, what I loved about my time. That is when I was serving for the Sultan of Oman for 3 years. This gentleman here is a man called Ahmed Harith al-Nabhani. And he and I were both young men together at about that stage, which is about 1985-86. And he went on to be the Chief of Defence Staff for Oman. So he and I almost had a 35-year friendship. This is both of us back at Sandhurst, at the tail end of both our careers, shaking hands on the steps of, or just by the steps of Old College. And it's just a microcosm of one of those knots that bind us to our friends in the Middle East. The monarchy, which I'll come back to, clearly Sandhurst, Dartmouth, Cranwell, London, universities, schools, and an extraordinary network of interests that we share. And although I'm actually going to talk about the whole of the Middle East, you know, the Gulf is one particular part of the Middle East. And those Gulf states that people know very well, I'm sure, either worked there or visited there or been on holiday to Dubai, to Oman, to Abu Dhabi. They thrived under British protectorates, really from the early 19th century right up until we decided foolishly to leave east of Suez in 1971. We never really left. And none of them, of course, were colonies, except for Aden. And I'll come back to that because I was brought up in Aden. And so that sort of current malaise that goes on about colonialism, decolonialism, imperialism, etc., really doesn't count here. And people who want to drive wedges between a really important part of the world where Britain continues to have great influence, great affection for the British there, as I say, great network of ties, really misunderstand our relationship. But of course the Gulf is not the Middle East. The Middle East is much wider than that. And in some ways it's almost an anomaly because it is in many ways so safe, it's so rich, it's so advanced in many ways, and so much of the reform in the Middle East that one would wish on other parts takes part in the Gulf region. And I came back from Riyadh. I was at the Riyadh International Book Festival, if you can believe such a thing, would have taken place even 5 years ago under Mohammed bin Salman, a very controversial character. But it is quite extraordinary, the shape of cultural and social change in a place that really had a stereotype. 3 slides, really. This is the Middle East, again, for those who know it, love it, watch it, etc., has, to my mind, 3 big sort of set of images. One is what I call the Orientalist. This was what was people like Edward Said in his book really deprecated. They said, oh, the way you romanticize the Middle East, you come out here and you write about belly dancers and minarets and dhows and camels in the desert and fierce, loyal, nomadic tribesmen. And it's all part of a Western attempt to culturally build up a narrative that allows you to dominate this part of the world. He, of course, was skillfully avoiding the fact that really for about 1,000 years it was largely the Muslims, both the Arabs, Turks, and up to a point the Iranians, that were very firmly on the front foot, really until the time of the great discoveries in the 16th century. So this is one that undoubtedly still holds good when we think about the Middle East. The second one is this one, of course, and the sort of list, that's Qasem Soleimani on the far right. He was the Quds Force commander of the Iranian Republican Guard Corps. He was killed by a drone strike outside Baghdad International Airport. This, of course, are these all too familiar pictures of ISIS fighters. They could be Al-Qaeda. This deeply, deeply damaging philosophy. It's called takfiri. And takfiri, if you ever see it, is the Arabic for your capacity to define people as heretics, and therefore your capacity to carry out, basically execute them. And that means you can attack infidels like ourselves, you can attack Shia, that's split in Islam as heretics, you can attack people who are compromisers, you can attack autocrats because they suppress Islam, you can attack monarchs. And its capacity is a bit like the Bolsheviks, to constantly reinvent itself and define itself by enemies. And this won't go away. We destroyed Islamic State as a sort of entity. We destroyed Al-Qaeda. We killed many of the leadership. But the ideology, particularly when it preys in a part of the world that has a huge numbers of young, particularly young men with no job, feel disenfranchised from the political system, can't get a job, can't get a house, can't get a girlfriend, can't marry, can't have children, therefore So the attraction of something like the mosque and something that gives them purpose is something very recognizable to those of us who witness gang warfare, but it has a religious theological. Anyway, there, of course, is oil, energy, absolutely back at the heart of issues, and occasionally when I talk about the interests of Britain in remaining heavily engaged with the Gulf, one always has to be careful about overemphasizing this transactional arrangement that we want to be friends with our friends in the Gulf because we need the oil and gas. But there is a reality in that. Equally, there's a reality that we contribute to stability. And the reality is, whether we like it or not, we are going to need the gas and oil that comes out of the Middle East for the next 30 or 40 years. That, sadly, happens to be an explosion in Yemen, a sort of ghastly war that's been going on now for 7 or 8 years. People sometimes forget in Yemen that the population of Oman is 2 million, the population of the Emirates 1 million, population of Qatar 400,000, minus expatriates. Population of Yemen 30 million. Shocking, hence the humanitarian crisis in an already poor country. And that is simply another, dare I say, another American task force going into the Gulf. And one thing I always said, and I know Sir Gerald was there the other day when I was giving a talk in Birmingham, is that you can always surge troops into the Gulf. What you can't surge is trust. This is a culture and a society, and again, many of you know it, so I'm not saying, but it's like any relationship. You can't just turn up on the day because you want something. It's like you've got to invest in relationships, particularly if they're important ones. The third one is this. To be honest with you, this is mostly, I would say, the Gulf, but it's also Turkey, and it's also Egypt in certain cases. And this is, huge ambition. That's the new Jeddah Formula One race course. That's on the far right is NEOM, the new Giga project that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia is driving forward. Here's a space mission that the Emiratis have put up. It's the 100th anniversary of the Turkish Republic next year. Certainly Erdogan claimed that he wanted to put a man on the moon, and we'll see where that goes. This is sort of the Al Ula over there, northeast Saudi Arabia, and many of you, I'm sure, have been to Jordan and been to Petra. And the Nabatean culture actually went into North Saudi Arabia. And you will now see photographs for advertising tourism in Saudi Arabia. None of us would ever have thought about that a few years ago, but it's true. And this is fascinating, and simply a picture of whippet-smart, intelligent, ambitious, well-educated young women absolutely taking a lead. And under King Abdullah, the last king, there was a King Salman, obviously, but the power is with Mohammed bin Salman, is about 300,000 young men, women, and married couples were sent abroad, largely to Anglo-sphere countries. And King Abdullah knew exactly what he was doing. He was building his own Trojan horse, because back came these whippet-smart women, and they were not going to be put back in the patriarchal bottle again. And it's quite remarkable what has happened. And there's no doubt about it, some of the turmoil we're seeing in Iran is the spillover from that equally young population looking across the Gulf via the medium of social media, the internet, and saying, if Saudi Arabia can begin to empower its women, allow them to drive, and more to come, why can't we? So it is interesting. Knotty issue of alcohol still to come. There are more women proportionally, percentage-wise, employed in Saudi Arabia than there are in America now. So stereotypes die very hard in that part of the world. So three elements of that. That is the economists' attempt to simplify the Middle East. But it is a bit like I'd say if you put up a mathematical equation, for me it would mean absolutely flog all. For those of you who study mathematics, you'd know how to interpret it. If you study the Middle East, if you understand, I suppose, ethnicity, confessional development, religion, history, then you can, this is actually fairly self-evident. I'm not asking you to look remotely at the detail. Because a lot of people step away from the Middle East because it is so complicated. And issues to do with cultural norms, issues to do with the continuing strength of religion, identity politics, where your identity as an Iraqi or a Syrian is not as important as your identity as an Alawite, as a Shia, as a Sunni, as a Druze, as a Maronite, etc., let alone your family and your clan. And impersonal relationships don't exist. Impersonal institutions don't exist. The chief of police is somebody's cousin or brother or father. Well, of course, he is here as well. But actually his loyalty, his or her loyalty, will be to policing. Doesn't exist out there. But you can understand some of these things if one knows some of the building blocks. Tim Marshall, again, I'm sure many of you either know him or know his book, Prisoners of Geography. And I would use the expression geography as history. And there is a capacity to really to understand inevitably why certain parts of the world are volatile, certain parts of the world behave in certain ways or always prone to being conquered. And of course here at the heart of the wider Middle East, and of course you could extend it all the way down to North Africa, are of course Istanbul, Constantinople, and the plains of Anatolia, the heartland of the Republic of Turkey, round here to the heartland of the Iranians on the Zagros Mountains, round here to the deserts of Saudi Arabia and Arabia, and then across to the Nile Delta. And in there you've got the Eastern Mediterranean, you've got the Suez Canal since 1869, and the veil of the Gateway of Tears. Unfortunately, because I've chosen to put a red background, I can't use a red laser. The Gateway of Tears into the Red Sea, and of course the Strait of Hormuz. And this is where historically nomadic armies have come out of the steppes, where they have always then tried to contest for the area around Mesopotamia. The land between the two rivers, the sort of birthplace of some of the great civilizations. And as they say, civilization is what you get when you have agricultural surplus and you can work out what to do with it. But of course, every time you set up a civilization, you make yourself extremely attractive to predatory nomads who are under certain pressure to move. And this has traditionally been a major route for armies to come. And of course, this was all the great trade routes as well. The Omanis and the Yemenis were the ones who took Islam to the Far East, where, of course, the largest Muslim country in the world is, of course, Indonesia. And geography is politics, and I just put that up, not on any of these slides to ask you to look really at the detail, so much as to say in this here, what we call the energy corridor, is 50% of all oil reserves in the world and 40% of all gas reserves. And every day through the Strait of Hormuz comes 20% of all the world's consumption of energy. 30 miles wide. And if you block that, and we've seen it blocked, or block the Suez Canal, and we've seen that blocked, you have a problem. What has changed dramatically, though, is so much of it used to come out and go west into the Red Sea through the Suez Canal into Western Europe and America. No longer. America is self-sufficient. So 80% of what's coming out of the Gulf is now going to China, India, and Japan. And these are facts of life. 80% of all energy used in the world is still fossil fuels, of which, as I say, 40 to 50% is in that part of the world. So the Middle East, that old paraphrase Trotsky, you may not be interested in the Middle East, but the Middle East will be interested in you. And there's a direct linkage, as you can imagine, to the renewed importance here with what's going on in Russia and Ukraine at the moment. So the more pressure we have with the Russians, the more important this will continue to be. And at the moment, we've seen just recently the Russians and the Saudi Arabians sat down and both chose to cut production to keep the prices up. So, the issues of Jamal Khashoggi, Mohammed bin Salman, how the Americans have treated the Saudi Arabians, calling them pariahs, and then going up as a supplicant, help us out, back to how you invest and how you understand what you're investing or criticizing. I just want to put this up. It's very easy to think of Egypt, of Syria, of Iraq, of the Gulf states, but this don't worry about the date really, but this is the high watermark really of the Ottoman Empire, when everything within that, to an extent, and there were lots of minority, lots of Christians, lots of Orthodox, lots of Armenians, lots of Kurds, lots of da-da-da. But fundamentally, that was ruled through an organizing principle of Allah, his messenger, the Prophet Muhammad, the 5 pillars of Islam, Arabic, not always spoken as Arabic, but written, and the idea that it was a Sunni Muslim capital. And it began in Mecca, moved to Medina, moved eventually to Damascus, moved across to Baghdad, went to Cairo, and eventually, when the Ottomans overthrew the Mamluks, went to Istanbul, which is where it stayed until the collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War and the abolition of both the Sultanate and the Caliphate. But people had no concept of nationalities. Well, Britain and Western Europe was very firmly developing on imperial lines. The French had an empire, the Germans had an empire, the Portuguese, the Spanish, but they had a concept of nationhood and state structures and kings, governments, etc. Not here. You went straight from your tribe or your family to the Sultan. So the catastrophe for this part of the world, the Islamic world, not always Arabic, of course, not all Arabs are, not all people who speak Arabic are Arabs, and not all Arabs are just are Muslim. But within all that diversity, the catastrophe for the region when the Caliphate was dismissed after, what we say, 1,700 years, 1,400 years rather, was enormous. And so these new senses of identity. That's the Middle East just before the Second World War. And it's just worth pointing, the French were dominating what is Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia. The Italians had crushed 2 Ottoman things into one. Egypt was dominated by the British. The British had the Gulf states and Aden there. And actually, increasingly, the Ottomans were losing ground, really, in the Balkans, and the Serbias, the Albanias, the Yugoslavias, which grew out of that. And Iran was very heavily dominated either by the British or by the Russians. And then after the Second World War, really, you had the whole thing, and I'm not going to go into it, it's in the book to an extent, the whole Sykes-Picot Agreement, the Balfour Declaration. But you end up with this. This is what we're very, very familiar with. But these lines on the map are completely illegitimate if you're Al-Qaeda or Islamic State. For them, it's how do you recreate the caliphate? And therefore, this was what was bizarre about the idea that Saddam Hussein was in cahoots with Osama bin Laden, because Osama bin Laden's whole philosophy was to take down the autocrats and the monarchies, kick the infidels out, the Americans and ourselves primarily, bring down, as I say, the House of Saud, and destroy these. And Islamic State, when they came into Mosul in 2014, symbolically bulldozed the berm, because that's all that existed there. If you again, there's a story in the book about a shepherd up there, and somebody said, "Why do you keep moving your sheep across the border between Syria and Iraq?" And he said, "Well, why did you put this bloody border through my sheep?" And he said, literally, for 1,000 years, that was it. They just moved. The Al-Shama tribe, huge tribe, in Saudi Arabia, now, of course, have to be not just the Al-Shama, they have to be Iraqis or Syrians, Saudis or Kuwaitis. It's against their thing. And this I put up because this was the Islamic State flag, and again, many of you will remember that at the time. That's Osama bin Laden, that's Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And this is what they claim. So they claim every part of the world where the black flag of Islam has flown. So, and we're all down, we know all the problems we've had in the Horn of Africa, over in Nigeria with Boko Haram, translated as no to Western education. There you are in the Balkans. Funnily enough, I don't know if anybody knows the Isle of Lundy. It was occupied at one stage by Barbary corsairs from North Africa, and that too is included on the ISIS flag and map. So it's a hugely ambitious approach, but it does rest on appalling bloodshed, and the idea that anybody who doesn't subscribe to that is fundamentally an enemy of Allah, the Prophet, and so this is interesting. And of course, these guys still claim that they are descended from the Al-Qurayshi tribe, because that's what you have to be a caliph. I put these up because this is part of the problem, as I referred to earlier. Water stress, urbanization, the influence of social media and the connectivity, and then this happens to be Egypt. If you looked at something similar for Italy, say, Germany, maybe less so Britain because of immigration, it largely looks like the Gherkin. In fact, in some countries, it's beginning to taper at the bottom, not taper at the top. And so this means that that is going to lead to a doubling of the population of the Middle East in the next 30 years. You just can't stop it via Armageddon, frankly. So we're going to put another about 400 million people into the Middle East, in a part of the world where you haven't got the economic, the cultural, the social structures to absorb them. And half of that, of course, are going to be the young men I talked about. And people are either going to move, and we're seeing these huge, we're in the foothills of the migration, or we're going to see more violence, and therefore more displaced people, more shattered, fractured, failed states. Which, as I say, is why the Gulf states are so different from the other parts of the of what we call the wider Middle East. And of course, the empowerment of women is also a great cultural challenge to people in the Middle East, who again have been used to very patriarchal, male-dominated societies for so long. So these are really important facts that have to be faced up to, and real challenges for policymakers. I throw this one up again. Don't look at the details so much as that happens to be the Achaemenids on the far right or left as you're looking. That was the Persians, and it's simply the band there, rather poorly put there by myself, not with my great PowerPoint skills. We'll just say it's around the area of Mesopotamia. The Persians, the Byzantines and the Persians, the Arabs within the first 100 years of the death of Muhammad, the Mamluks when the leadership of the Arab Islamic world moved to Cairo, and then the Ottomans. So this historical entitlement, issues of selective historical grievance and historical inspiration and entitlement really underpin all sorts of mythologies. We have that in this country. The French do, Spanish do, Germans do, whatever. We all have a mythology that binds us together. But it depends how impactful it is on the politics. And so this historical entitlement also leads to grievance as well. And this next one, an important one, is just, again, I don't want to go into the detail because it is complicated, but this man really was like sort of Martin Luther King. This is Shah Ismail, who converted Iran, and Iranians are distinctly different from Arabs and distinctly different from Turks. And that ethnicity needs to be, again, understood as part of the volatility. But Shah Ismail converted Iran to Shiism. He made Shiism the official religion, a bit of the way that, a bit like Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And so on top of an ethnic Persian Arab dislike, visceral dislike, he then imposed a sort of heretical Sunni Shia division. And if you look at the red there, you'll see Iran, but you'll also see the large Sunni Shia majority in Iraq, which we have seen after the overthrow of Saddam, hence this. And then you take the Alawites, who are a Shia sect in Syria. There's Bashar al-Assad. And then you get Hezbollah in Lebanon. So when we overthrew Saddam Hussein, we allowed, that's Khomeini, many of us will remember him, we allowed Tehran to use their Shia co-religionists to dominate Baghdad, therefore Iraq, to basically save Bashar al-Assad during the civil war and to sponsor Hezbollah. And hence why it's interesting in a sort of Chinese way, the problems that are going on in Iran. And I just put these up. That's President Erdogan, that's President Raisi, that's the Crown Prince, and that's President Sisi in Egypt. All of them on their shoulders carry this sense of historical entitlement on behalf of the Turks, the Iranians, the Arabs, and the Egyptians. And that plays into how they mobilize their own supporters. Just to come in really a few slides about my own family. That's my mother. She was an extraordinary woman. She was one of 3 sisters who became doctors. She was born in the 1880s. She couldn't go to Trinity Dublin. She was in Macroom in Cork. I've never been to Cork myself. The father, his father had made money providing remounts for the British Army in the Crimean War. And he said to his girls that they were not going to be dependent on marriage to make their way in the world. My grandmother there took the maths test for all of Ireland. Of course, it was still a state part of the UK, United Kingdom state. Came top. Was one of the first women in her. She was the only woman in her medical cohort. She came top of that, as did her sister 2 years later. She went off to Edinburgh. She had a practice in Edinburgh. We're talking about 1912 at this stage. Then went to Bradford. Did a lot of public health work. Then in 1916. At about the time of the Somme and the fag end of the Gallipoli campaign, the word went out, we're running out of male doctors, and she was one of 60 female doctors who volunteered to go into uniform. And she wasn't able to wear rank, because there were no female officers in the British Army, but you can see she's wearing the cap badge of the Royal Army Medical Corps. And she was deployed it's the lady, again, if I could use the pointer, about 4 in, with a sort of bun just on the left shoulder of that young chap, that military man sitting down. So she was in Malta, where Malta was known as the nurse of the Mediterranean. I would say doctor, not a nurse, plenty of very gallant nurses, but one of those rare beasts, a doctor. Her sister was with her. Her sister went on to Salonika. In 1924, after they'd been demobbed, my grandmother ended up on the Western Front in 1918 during the time of the Great German Offensive. And in 1924, at the tail end of the horrible civil war in Ireland after the creation of the Free State, she taught herself Urdu and then went on a ship to India to help set up the Lady Hardinge Hospital for Women and Children in New Delhi. And the same year, my grandfather, who I'll put a slide up next, he also took a ship. He was in a protected industry during the First World War because he built docks. And in fact, a lot of his technology became incorporated in the Mulberry docks and the Mulberry harbours, those D-Day concrete constructions that were so critical for the build-up after D-Day itself. So she was an extraordinary woman, and she had my mother. My mother was conceived in India, but my grandmother, that's 43 years old. So between 1929. So I won't need to tell anybody here who has children, that's not at any time, 43 years is not 43 years old, not a good time to be having your first child. And she took my mother back to England to have the child, came back out. It was a very unhappy marriage, sadly. And in 1937, she came back to England with my mother, and then decamped, having said, I've been through one world war, I'm going to sit this one out. And she went back to Ireland. And my mother, we'll come on to my mother. My mother then, because she couldn't speak Gaelic, couldn't take any exams, ended up on the Dublin Gate Theatre, became an actress. That's my grandfather, the chap in the white suit. And the connection there is, when he left India in 1948, actually after partition, he was asked to stay on in India. He was the chairman of the Port Trust of Cochin all the way through the Second World War. He came back and he went to Aden, which is where we live. There's a couple of photographs coming up, and built a thing called Mayall Straits. His great speciality was reclamation, dredging and reclamation. And he did amazing works. And when we had been basically moved, this was actually before Suez, he went to build a big new sort of shopping / residential area in Aden, which still exists. I've been there. That is Field Marshal Auchinleck, again, known to many of you, many, I'm sure, military historians here or just historians who will know that. And this is myself in 1980 with Field Marshal Auchinleck. And I remember saying, you gave my grandfather his commander of the Indian Empire, and we've still got the letter that he signed off, one of those nice letters you get from senior officers. And I caught him 3 months before he died. I don't think there's any connection between my visit and the fact that he died 3 months later. Utterly charming. For me, it was one of the last of the greats of the Second World War. That's my father. He had met my mother coming at a bus stop when she was coming from the Duke of York's theatre. And he was sent out to the Canal Zone. And he was there at the time when Gamal Abdel Nasser overthrew King Farouk. And there was still a huge garrison on the Suez Canal. And of course, only a few years later, Gamal Abdel Nasser, having overthrown the monarchy, then staged what blew into the Suez Crisis, where we were sadly let down by our American friends. And then we'd actually come out of Palestine already. The state of Israel had been formed with all the consequences we have seen from that, further complicated, even already complicated area. The Indian flag is simply, the whole period of decolonization and retreat from empire was taking place, Suez Crisis. And this one simply, 30,000 ships a year go through the Suez Canal, absolutely critical. And again, many of you will remember the Ever Given that managed to jam itself. And instantly the supply lines of the world were cut. And of course, in the Suez Crisis, and again during the Yom Kippur War, in the 67 war and the 73 war when it was closed, extraordinary impact, and adds another 7,000 kilometers to go around. So very interesting for my father. But he was on the Canal Zone. He wasn't aware. Shepherd Hotel getting burnt down, Farouk going, the Free Army officers taking over, etc. But interesting times. We went to Aden in 1960. My parents had the only air conditioner in a junior officer's flat, thanks to my grandfather being there. And happy days. It all ended horribly, as we know. NASA was interfering, the Soviets and the Chinese were interfering, but that's my grandmother who took a troop ship and came out. My father there, in happy days. And my father, about 6'4", so he was always selected to do the honor guards. That happens to be Lord Mountbatten. And this here, behind my mother, myself in those rather fetching Vilboquin shorts, and my brother, who's now a doctor in Australia, that was the armed Aden police. And in 1967, there was a feeling that we'd supported the Israelis, and it just added to the mutiny then. And there's the aircraft my father flew. I went to join the army in 73. I went to be selected. I was at a school, Ludgrove, the other day, and I said, right, which one of these young chaps at the top do you think I am? And thank God they didn't choose number 32, but they went round almost everybody else except number 34. And of course, the backdrop to my time there was the Yom Kippur War. There's Ariel Sharon, there's Moshe Dan, again, very, very, very well known to those. And afterwards, of course, Sheikh Yamani at the bottom, and the use of the oil weapon. The transfer of a huge transfer of wealth, which of course has led in many ways to that extraordinary growth of these mega cities in the Gulf. That's the Burj Al Khalifa. Again, I'm sure many of you have been to them, but it was a change in the guard again. 79, Sandhurst, but a very interesting time. Again, many of you will recall this. The Shah fell that year. There was the Egyptian-Israeli peace accord, for which Anwar Sadat paid with his life, killed by the Muslim Brotherhood. This is the siege of the Great Mosque, and here, of course, as if we hadn't had enough in 1979, was the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviets. And here, of course, trying to get House of Saud, trying to get the initiative back off the jihadists, of course, then funneled all that money into Afghanistan, along with the ideology of the Wahhabists, with all the consequences we know. 1980s, I was out in Oman. I got a couple of sort of glamour shots. And again, if people can maybe remember, it was the Iran-Iraq war at the same time as it was the Mujahideen against the Soviets. And of course, we absolutely backed the Mujahideen. But of course, this guy and the jihadists from the Arab world were being, it was the great Islamic jihadi victory against the godless, atheistic Russians. I was doing my time in Oman. That's that young man who I'm shaking hands with at Sandhurst, young captain. That's Sultan Qaboos. Sultan Qaboos recognized these bright young Omanis. They'd come out of the desert. They'd come down from the Jebel, and they were all sent off to places like Sandhurst, taught English, and developed a great, I'd like to say, love of the country. And this, again, if you're a soldier, I know Martin's there and a number of military men, this is the sort of thing that does set your blood racing slightly if you're prone to that sort of the glamour of soldiering. 1991, I went back. Who was to know at that stage the Soviet Union was going to collapse? And then suddenly Saddam's tanks, having rolled into Iran, rolled back, moved south into Kuwait. And these sort of things, that's the highway of death. The images then were undoubtedly, the power of imagery, undoubtedly were one of the reasons we probably pulled the plug on the war too soon. There's no doubt about it, and that was part of the reason, again, we went back in 2003. And I'm sure if Margaret Thatcher had still been in power there, and there's a little anecdote in the book, when I met her and said, would you have stopped the war if you had still been in power? And she said, categorically not. We had not defeated the Iraqi Republican Guard. She was not advocating going on to Baghdad, but there are consequences for both doing and not doing things. I simply put that up. The king down there is Colonel of the Queen's Green Guards, but that, again, I mentioned it earlier, the relationship between the monarchies and the power of the monarchy still as part of Britain's soft power is quite extraordinary. And of course, politicians come and go, as we all know, but so many of the people out in the Middle East knew Her Majesty, know His Majesty well. And this was the time of the Balkans. Again, a sort of fault line of Islam and Christendom. As I say, the Ottoman Empire retreating and leaving behind it a whole raft of bitter ethnic and religious divides. 2001, I'm sure everybody in this church will remember exactly where they were on the morning of the 11th of September. I think it's seared in our minds. Again, I was actually sitting writing reports in my brigade headquarters, and within a couple of months we were into Afghanistan, and lo and behold, we all saw last year what happened when Biden decided to use the 20th anniversary of this awful event to pull out of Afghanistan. And we can all have a debate about the wisdom of it, or the sense of bereavement that certain parents, etc., who will have lost sons or daughters will have felt with the failure of that mission. Into Iraq, I've talked about this. By removing Saddam, we undoubtedly led to the empowerment of the jihadists of Al-Qaeda, and in due course of Islamic State. And that's Qasem Soleimani again. So very quickly, we, American troops, very quickly after the so-called success of overthrowing Saddam, found ourselves in a civil war between the Iranians and the Shia backers, the Shia militia, and in some ways the Sunnis, the ex-Baathists who we'd overthrown, particularly when we disbanded the army and we threw out everybody who had a Baathist ticket, and then all the jihadists who flocked to Iraq, having finished in Afghanistan. And that went on for over a decade because, I say, of the convening power of the Takfiri ideology. I was there 2006-07. I was a deputy corps commander. That's a marvelous man called Peter Corelli. I was working with David Petraeus, George Casey, Ray Odierno, a whole bunch of extraordinarily gallant, patriotic, committed Americans, but with a strategy that was quite clearly failing, and a set of tactics that were no longer appropriate to what we were trying to achieve. That was the headquarters, called slightly prematurely, I always felt, Camp Victory. And I had a small, again, you won't necessarily see it at the back, there's a small villa on the lake. And occasionally a sort of rocket used to sort of, thank God, at least land in the lake rather than on me. And that's negotiating with, down in the corner, with a chap called Nouri al-Maliki. He was Prime Minister of Iraq, a lot of patriotic Iraqis, but he was very much in the pocket of the Iranians. And his position in power depended on the support of his Shia militia, who were terrified, of course, about the return of Saddam Hussein and things. So, one can be critical about the failure to come up with secular liberal regimes, but unless you're prepared to factor in these ethnic divisions and the religious divisions, it's difficult. And that's myself with some Joe Anderson, who became a 3-star, and General Riyad, who was another guy. He was a Sunni, in fact, trying to work gallantly for the Iraqis. We walked straight in from that to the Arab Spring. We largely pulled out. People will remember quite a lot of controversy about the British withdrawal from Basra Palace. It got tied up, of course, with the Blair Brown years, etc. And then we saw, Tahrir Square. I'd love to have talked to Jeremy Byrne. I was supposed to be interviewing him yesterday about our failure to, our propensity to think that the Arab Spring was an extension of the fall of the Berlin Wall, instead of something that had elements of that in terms of young people wanting reform, sick of corruption, etc., but also a coalition of agendas, which we had seen at the fall of the Shah, where we'd cheered on sort of reform that had gone too far or hadn't gone far enough. And these were the so that's the sort of analogy there. And what we, of course, saw then was, having removed Saddam and then began to see these civil wars, Tunisia, obviously in Cairo, definitely in Syria, we began to see the likes of Russia, particularly after 2013, when Obama didn't cross his own red line about the use of chemical weapons in Damascus. And there's Qasem Soleimani again, the Rommel, the Shia Rommel of the thing, going out there, spinning up the Shia militia, be it Hezbollah. Hezbollah came out of Lebanon, went into Syria. So a toxic combination of Iranians, the Alawite regime, the Russians, Hezbollah, were what kept Assad in power. And we missed our opportunity in 2013. And this time, 2011 to 2015, my last job in the army to an extent. That remains a great friend of mine, Hamid Ali Al-Attiyah. That's Qatar. Qatar, interesting country, we could come back to that. There's King Abdullah II with our British ambassador there. There I was presenting a certificate to the 5,000th member of the Peshmerga, those who die, which were the Kurdish troops, which again, it's a story in itself, the Kurds, their inability to get a homeland after the First World War. And we British had been training them up. What we didn't do, sadly, we didn't accompany them into the field. And we couldn't persuade our politicians, I know Gerald will be sympathetic to that point of view, that if you're going to train and advise, you've got to accompany. And there's a moral imperative to go outside the wire and share the danger. This is the sort of culture that will follow leaders who will, not that they need a huge amount of geeing up the Kurds. And this last one, it's something I'm seriously very proud of, is I found a moment of opportunity in both the British government and the Middle East to persuade the King of Bahrain to build the first permanent British military base east of Suez since 1971. And we now have a permanent presence in the Gulf. And the Navy very handsomely said, well, thank you, General. we'll name the centre square after you. So I feel, there's a corner of a foreign field that is forever England, which is nice. But the Royal Navy, we've got 9 Royal Navy ships in the Gulf at the moment. So our capacity to use that in support of British national interests with the Americans, for instance, is hugely useful for the likes of Liz Truss or James Cleverly. And I think that's really the last slide. There's my friend Hamid Ali Al-Attiyah, the Qatari, and that's us hunting the little bustard in southern Morocco. And here's my great friend Akvid Harith Al-Nabani and myself celebrating 40 years of engagement. And I say in my case, nearly 100 years of male family engagement in the Middle East. Get rid of that one. Yes, I say. So I'll simply put on that one. When one understands the geography, ethnicity, religion, then actually this is, as I say, it becomes like a mathematical equation that you begin to understand where the arrows go. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for your time and your patience. I really, really appreciate it. I'm delighted to take any questions because I know, as I say, many of you will have your own very strong connections with the Middle East or interest there. Thank you.
Qatar.
Yes. Yep.
And the World Cup's about to be hosted there. There's been human rights issues with its construction, and this chap called Mark Bennett,
Yep.
who was headed Qatar Airways PR function, who disappeared in December. What are your thoughts on the evolution of Qatar?
Well, I sometimes think people give the Gulf states a hard time because they're monarchies. There are 40 applicants for every job in the Middle East. Without the Middle East, the GDP of Bangladesh, for instance, would be about 2/3 of what it is. It's a huge money-making machine that takes hard labor, and it used to be a lot harder. I'm not saying construction work is hard labor, and recycles money back into communities that without it would have absolutely no chance of clawing their way out of poverty. So this is not an apology for it. They are deeply aware through, dare I say, this, of course, that their reputation is at risk. And I think they've made huge inroads into it. A lot of the criticism of the Gulf states comes from the Muslim Brotherhood, although in Qatar, funnily enough, there's quite a close linkage there, whose aim is to overthrow the monarchies. And they find a very, very willing audience among certain elements of the press who then run these various articles. So I am not an apologist for them, but I am, when I look at what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, when I look at the corruption sub-Saharan Africa, and I look at some of the horror stories going on in Burma, and then I look at someone like Qatar, which is providing huge amounts of money for individuals, within which I totally accept there is abuse. There are 300,000 Qataris, there are 2 million expats there. So these are the sort of numbers, and they have really driven down the calf, and I'd say that across the Gulf. But if you go there, I don't know if you, have you been there? It's a bit like saying to people who are critical about Saudi Arabia, go there. You will go to the church, you will go to the malls, you will go to the restaurants, you'll go to the hotels. You will not see an oppressed slave culture. That is not to say, however, that people on building sites are not in a position where they've either been abused or the Health and Safety Acts aren't there. But given the importance of the region, what they're trying to do, the constraints, how threatened they are, I'm always prepared to put in a good word for the Gulf Arabs when I look at what's around them. But it's right, they understand it, they get it, but in many ways they don't want people who are now coming to beg them for more LNG to be saying, I want the luxury of criticizing you and shouting at you through my megaphone, and then I want to sneak in and say, oh, could you give us another, jerry can of oil, please, while you're waiting. So I think it's a great place, and it'll be a great World Cup. Yeah, and they get it. Thank you for the question. Very, 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 very well posed.
Are you hopeful that the protests in Iran will lead to permanent change?
I'm both hopeful and fearful, without doubt. I think the tragedy, of course, is that the reform movements never start long enough. I always remember, again, lecturing on this, I think I put it in the book, Wordsworth saying, I think it was Wordsworth or Shelley, saying, bliss it was in that dawn to be alive, but to young was very heaven, at the outbreak of the French Revolution. And the trouble was the Ancien regime had kept the lid on for so long that when it eventually popped out, all sorts of unpleasantness came with it, as we saw in Russia, as we saw in any number of revolutions. My worry, of course, is I'm 100% behind the protesters. I think the Iranian regime is absolutely foul. Again, it comes back to, I do think the Iranians sometimes get more of a buy in the press while we continue to beat up the Sunnis, who are fundamentally allied and useful. The Iranians are nothing but malign in the area, be it nuclear power, be it the way they treat their own population, be it the sort of likes of Qasem Soleimani, be it their ballistic thing, parasitic, worst. But if the regime was to fall, I think there'd be a lot of violence to start with, because the Basij, the Iranian Republican Guard Corps, will not give up their position. So I think revolutions happen when people are not prepared to any longer gun down their own population. So I am hopeful from one point of view, because the Iranians utterly deserve better. One of their great criticisms is that they're whitewashed from history. The Americans only think of them as people with black turbans locking up American diplomats, and they'll say, look at the Achaemenids, look at the Achaemenids, look at the Sasanians, look at the Safavids. Nobody's heard of them. Not strictly true. So they get white, but I do why. They're a great, great nation. They feel it very strongly as an previous empire, regional power, champion of the Shias, very proud of what they've done. But if it collapses, it'll have all sorts of other consequences. But equally, we may have to go with that, because the status quo is a shocking position for all those young people, men and women, that suppression of human capacity and human capability, in support of this ghastly regime in Tehran. So yeah, a mixture of hope and fear.
From your experience in the Gulf, do you think the Abraham Accords will give the Gulf states sufficient power to stand up against Iran?
No.
No.
I think it's a great step forward, actually. It's a remarkable step forward. It was one of the few achievements of Trump, who clattered around the Middle East, causing all sorts of mayhem. It was interesting. It's interesting if you talk. When I was in Birmingham the other day, the Saudi the Saudi ambassador was there, who's a member of the royal family. And he said, very interestingly, the new generation, that great bulge, I said, for them, the Israel-Palestine issue is no longer, front and center. So it was a big move for Bahrain, for UAE, for Morocco, I think Jordan was for Sudan, sorry, to sign the Abraham Accords. We then all thought maybe the Saudis would do it. I think it's difficult for them. Again, if you think back to 1990, Al-Qaeda took against the House of Saud because they allowed infidels onto the land of the two holy cities. So I think Mohammed bin Salman will be loath to go with it. But the reality is they'd like to. They don't feel, you're quite right, Iran is the threat. Israel is no threat. Israel is a real fly in the ointment for the whole Islamic world and the Muslims, because it's used, as are the Palestinians, in a sort of zero-sum game. So it was a way forward. The Saudis may yet go down the Abraham Accord world. As you say, at the heart of it is common interest in facing down the Iranians, and so I think it's at least something. Again, when I look back at some of the mindset we have about the Middle East, that gives some cause for hope. But none of those countries are major players. Admittedly, the other one, of course, is Egypt still has a relationship with Israel. And both Israel, it's not just Iran, it is the Takfiri influence that is equally worries both Israel and the Sunni and the mainstream Sunni regimes or monarchies. But I'll be interested to see if it goes much further. And again, back to that lady's question, the whole Iran future, i.e. malign or revolution, both will have consequences for the region and much wider.
A war, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and Britain and the West really essentially had a complete ability to
probably you said just
had a complete ability to rearrange the region, and they did it on the basis of nation states, and I don't think they did that very well, because why there isn't a Kurdistan, I do not know. But what else could they have done? What else could they have done?
Yeah.
If they hadn't gone down the nation state?
Very good question. I've always, when I say again, sympathetic, because I've been a policy maker, I've been close to government. It's always worth reminding people, we just had 800,000 of our youngsters killed on the Western Front and fighting the Ottomans. We were trying to rearrange the whole world, including sort of keeping a handle on, India, etc. So at the height of people's priorities was not necessarily the Middle East. I think genuinely when we went in and had McMahon was in correspondence with Sharif Hussein, and this idea that Lawrence took, which is you will get the Arab lands back, began to get eroded quite early on because of the British desire to keep Mosul and the oil founded there. And then, of course, really founded on the fact that we were fighting for our survival against the Germans alongside our French allies. And the French were determined that they would also have a slice of the cake. And the bigger the slice of the cake they demanded, the more the British decided they'd have an even bigger slice. We did try and put, as you know, Faisal into Damascus, but the French threw him out. The French, of course, divided Lebanon from Syria, although traditionally Greater Syria had always included that, and that was done on the basis of protecting the Maronites and the Catholics. And so you did end up with the trade space I talked about in the geography, where eventually, of course, the Gulf states went on for quite a long time before they became anything other than tribal states. Part of the problem was also what we had, which was an idea we'd have a Kurdish homeland, was overthrown by Kemal Ataturk, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who of course absolutely just drove a kibosh through that as well. So there are a number of reasons. The one thing we might not have done is the consequence of the Balfour Declaration. On top of everything else where we appear to be betraying the Arabs, coming up with this, as you say, set of false, completely new identities based on the nation state, and then into what had been, as I say, that feeling of some sort of commonality of a caliph, a sultan, we're all Muslims together, largely some minority, to actually go for a homeland which eventually became the state of Israel, was one of those, if you look at it, unforced errors. No disrespect to the state of Israel, always a contentious issue to discuss. But that, to my mind, was just adding even more complexity onto a world that was in absolute turmoil at the end of the First World War. So I'm both sympathetic and conscious of the cynicism of some of the selfish motivations behind policymakers.